I didn't cry when he kicked me. Not until I saw who was watching. The mall was too bright for a Thursday afternoon. The kind of artificial white light that made everything look cleaner than it really was, like it could wash away mistakes if you stood under it long enough. But nothing about that moment felt clean, not the sound of my shoe scraping against polished tile as I stumbled, not the sharp intake of breath from strangers pretending not to stare, not the quiet humiliation that settled in my chest like something heavy and permanent. My shopping bag slipped from my fingers, paper tearing just enough for the contents to spill out, a pair of discounted flats, a folded sweater I debated buying for 20 minutes, small things that suddenly felt smaller scattered across the floor. I stayed down for a second longer than I should have, my palm pressed against the cold tile, feeling the faint vibration of footsteps passing by, people choosing distance over involvement, because that's what people do. They keep walking. They keep their lives intact by not stepping into someone else's mess. Still clumsy, Emily? Jason's voice hadn't changed, still smooth, still carrying that easy confidence that used to feel like safety and now felt like something else entirely, something colder, something sharp around the edges. I didn't look up right away. I already knew what I'd see. Expensive shoes, polished to a mirror shine, the kind that never touched anything dirty long enough to leave a mark. I pushed myself to my feet slowly, brushing my hands against my jeans like I could erase what just happened, like I could rewind a few seconds and choose a different path through the mall, a different life altogether. I'm fine, I said, even though no one had asked, my voice quieter than I intended, thinner somehow, like it didn't belong to me anymore. Jason laughed, not loud, not cruel enough to draw attention, just enough to make the moment feel smaller, like I was something insignificant he'd stepped over on his way to something better. You always say that, he replied, tilting his head slightly, studying me like I was a version of his past he couldn't quite remember why he kept around. The woman next to him shifted her weight, her heels clicking softly against the tile, her eyes flicking over me for half a second before settling back on him, uninterested, unaffected, perfectly composed in a way I used to try to be. I bent down to gather my things, fingers trembling just enough to make it noticeable if anyone was really looking. But no one was, no one ever is, not when it matters. The sweater was still folded, the flats still in their box, everything exactly as it had been before except for me. I stood again, holding the bag tighter this time, like I could anchor myself with something physical, something simple. You shouldn't be here, Jason said, almost casually, like he was commenting on the weather, like the space itself belonged to him and I had wandered in by mistake. I opened my mouth, ready to say something, anything that would make me feel less like I was shrinking under those lights, but the words didn't come. They stayed somewhere behind my ribs, caught between who I used to be and who I was now. And that's when I felt it, not a sound, not a touch, just a shift in the air, like something had changed without anyone announcing it. I didn't turn immediately. I didn't need to. There was a presence behind me, steady and quiet, the kind that didn't demand attention but somehow held it anyway. I lifted my gaze just enough to catch the reflection in the glass storefront across from us, and for a second, everything else disappeared. A black car parked just beyond the entrance, sleek, unmoving, out of place in a way that made it impossible to ignore. The door wasn't open, no one stepping out, no dramatic entrance, just stillness, controlled and deliberate. And then I saw him, not clearly, not fully, just a glimpse through the tinted window, a silhouette that didn't move, didn't react, just watched. My breath caught, not because I understood why, but because something inside me recognized it, that kind of stillness, that kind of attention. Jason kept talking, his voice fading into the background, words blending together into something meaningless, because suddenly, none of it felt like the center of the moment anymore. It wasn't the mall, it wasn't the people, it wasn't even Jason. It was that car, that silence, that gaze I could feel without ever meeting it directly. And for the first time since I hit the floor, I realized something that made my chest tighten in a completely different way. I wasn't alone in this moment. I had never been alone. I told myself not to turn around, not to look for something that might not even be real, because hope had a way of making everything worse when it disappeared, but my body did not listen to logic anymore. It moved on instinct, slow at first, just enough to shift my weight, just enough to change the angle of my reflection in the glass, and then I saw it more clearly. The outline of the car door opening with a quiet precision that somehow carried more authority than any loud gesture ever could. And everything inside me went still again. Not the same stillness as before, not the kind that came from humiliation, but something sharper, something aware. Jason was still talking, his voice cutting through the air like it always had, confident, dismissive, certain that he controlled the space around him. But for the first time since I had known him, he was not the center of the room anymore, even if he did not realize it yet. "You should have learned by now," he said, shaking his head slightly as if disappointed in a version of me he had already discarded. "People do not just get second chances, Emily." The words landed, but they did not settle the same way they used to. They did not sink in and stay. They hovered somewhere outside of me, like noise that I could choose not to absorb. I tightened my grip on the torn bag, feeling the rough edge of the paper press against my fingers, grounding me in something real, something immediate. "Maybe they do," I said quietly, and I was not sure if I believed it yet, but it felt different saying it out loud, like testing a truth I had not fully accepted. Jason let out a short breath that almost sounded like a laugh, his eyes flicking past me for a fraction of a second, and that was the moment everything shifted. It was subtle, so subtle that anyone else might have missed it, but I had spent years learning how to read him, how to notice the smallest changes before they became something bigger, and I saw it in the way his posture adjusted, in the way his shoulders straightened just slightly, in the way his gaze did not come back to me immediately. Someone else had entered his awareness. I did not have to guess who. The sound of footsteps behind me was measured, unhurried, each step placed with a kind of certainty that did not need to announce itself, and the conversations around us began to fade. Not all at once, not dramatically, but piece by piece, like a room slowly realizing something important was happening without knowing exactly what. I turned then, not fully, just enough to see him in my peripheral vision, and the first thing I noticed was not his face, not his expression, but the way people moved, or rather, the way they stopped moving when he passed, as if space itself adjusted to make room for him without being asked. He wore a dark coat, tailored in a way that made it impossible to ignore the precision of it, every line clean, every detail intentional, and there was something about the way he carried himself that made everything else feel less significant, like the mall, the lights, the noise, all of it existed on a different level than he did. He did not look at me right away. His attention went to Jason first, not aggressively, not confrontationally, just a steady, assessing gaze that lingered long enough to say more than words ever could. Jason swallowed, a small movement, almost invisible, but it was there, and I felt it like a shift in the air pressure around us. "Is there a problem here?" the man asked, his voice low, controlled, the kind that did not need volume to be heard, and for a second, I forgot how to breathe. Jason opened his mouth, ready to respond, ready to reassert whatever control he thought he still had, but nothing came out immediately, and that alone told me everything had already changed. I looked between them, my heart beating faster now, not from fear, not from embarrassment, but from something I could not quite name yet, something that felt dangerously close to relief. The man's gaze moved then, finally, landing on me, and it was not cold, not distant, but it was intense in a way that made it impossible to look away, like he was seeing more than just the moment in front of him, like he was measuring something deeper, something that mattered. "Are you hurt?" he asked, and it was such a simple question, so ordinary, but no one had asked me that in a very long time, not like it mattered what the answer was. I shook my head automatically, the habit of minimizing everything still too ingrained to break in a single second. "I am fine," I said, the same words again. But this time they felt different, like they were no longer the end of the conversation, just the beginning of something I did not yet understand. He held my gaze for a moment longer, then nodded once, as if acknowledging something unspoken, and when he looked back at Jason, the silence that followed was not empty. It was full of something heavy, something final, something that made it clear without a single raised voice that whatever had just happened was not going to be ignored. Jason tried to recover first. I could see it in the way his jaw tightened, in the way his shoulders squared like he was stepping back into a version of himself that had never been questioned, never been interrupted, and for a second, it almost worked, almost looked convincing, like he could pretend this was still his scene, still his control, but something in the air refused to bend back into place. "No problem," he said finally, forcing a small smile that did not quite reach his eyes, his voice smoother now. Calculated, careful. "Just a misunderstanding." The man did not respond right away. He did not nod, did not accept the answer, did not challenge it either. He simply stood there, still as before, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make the words feel insufficient. I felt it again. That pressure, not physical, not visible, but real, like standing too close to the edge of something you could not see the bottom of. "A misunderstanding," the man repeated, not as a question, not as agreement, just as if he was testing how the words sounded out loud. And suddenly Jason's confidence slipped. Just a fraction, just enough for me to notice. The woman beside him shifted again, her hand brushing lightly against his arm, not for comfort, but for reassurance, as if she needed to remind herself that he was still the same person he had been 5 minutes ago. I watched Jason glance around, quick, subtle, checking who was watching, who might be. Paying attention now, because attention had shifted, it had gathered around us without anyone announcing it, drawn by something they could feel but not explain. "We were just leaving," Jason added, his tone changing slightly, less dismissive now, more careful, like he was negotiating something he did not fully understand. The man's gaze did not leave him. It did not harden, did not soften. It simply stayed, steady and unblinking. And for the first time since I had known Jason, I saw uncertainty settle into his expression in a way that could not be hidden. "You should," the man said quietly, and there was nothing threatening in the words, nothing raised, nothing sharp, but the finality in them landed heavier than anything louder ever could. Jason hesitated, just for a second, and then he nodded, quick, almost automatic, like his body had decided before his mind could argue. And that alone made something inside me shift again, something that felt like a line being redrawn without my permission. He turned, guiding the woman beside him with a light touch at her back, and they started to walk away, not fast, not running, but not slow either, not lingering, not looking back. I watched them go, my chest still tight, but not in the same way as before, not heavy with humiliation, but filled with something unfamiliar, something that felt like space opening up where there had been none. The mall noise returned slowly, like someone turning the volume back up after a pause, conversations picking up, footsteps resuming, the ordinary world slipping back into place as if nothing had happened, as if moments like that did not leave marks you could not see. I let out a breath I did not realize I had been holding, my fingers loosening slightly around the torn bag, the tension draining in uneven waves. "You dropped this," the man said, and I blinked, looking down to see the last item I had missed, a small receipt, crumpled near his shoes. He bent to pick it up before I could react, his movements precise, unhurried, and when he handed it to me, his fingers did not touch mine, but the space between them felt charged, like something unspoken had passed anyway. "Thank you," I said, my voice softer now, steadier, though I was not entirely sure why. He studied me for a moment, not in a way that made me feel small, not in a way that judged or dismissed, but in a way that felt intentional, like he was placing me somewhere in his mind, somewhere specific. "You are not fine," he said, not accusing, not correcting, just stating something he believed to be true, and I felt my breath catch again because he was right, and no one had ever said it out loud like that before, not without expecting something in return. I looked down at the bag, at the torn edge, at the small things I had tried to hold together, and for a second, I did not know how to answer. "I will be," I replied after a moment, the words coming out slower, more deliberate, like I was choosing them carefully this time. And when I looked back up, his expression had shifted just slightly, something almost imperceptible, but there, like he had heard more than just the words. He nodded once, a small, contained gesture, and then his gaze moved past me briefly, scanning the space with a quiet awareness that made me realize he had never stopped paying attention to everything around him. "You should not be here alone," he added, his voice still calm, still even, but there was something underneath it now, something protective, something that made my pulse quicken for reasons I could not fully explain. I almost told him I was used to it, that being alone was not new, that it was easier that way, but the words did not come, because standing there, under those bright lights, with the echo of what had just happened still lingering in the air, I realized something that unsettled me more than anything else. For the first time in a long time, being alone did not feel like the safest option anymore. I should have walked away right then, should have thanked him again and disappeared into the crowd like nothing had happened, like I had always done before. But my feet stayed where they were, anchored by something I could not quite name, something that felt heavier than fear and quieter than relief. I live close, I said finally, the words automatic, defensive, like I needed to prove I could still handle my own life, that I was not someone who needed help, even after everything that had just unfolded. He did not argue. He did not insist. He simply watched me for a second longer, and there was something in that silence that made me feel like he was weighing more than just my words, like he was measuring the space between what I said and what was true. Close does not always mean safe, he replied, his tone unchanged, calm, controlled, but there was a certainty in it that made my chest tighten in a different way. I glanced toward the entrance of the mall, where the light shifted slightly as people moved in and out, the outside world just beyond those glass doors, familiar and distant at the same time. I have managed so far, I said, softer now, not quite as convincing, and I hated that he could probably hear it, that he could probably see right through the version of strength I had spent years building. He nodded once, not dismissing me, not agreeing either, just acknowledging the statement like it was a fact that existed but did not define the whole picture. Managing is not the same as being safe, he said, and something about the way he said it made the words linger longer than they should have. I shifted my weight, adjusting the torn bag in my hands, suddenly aware of how small everything I was holding felt compared to the weight of the moment. Why do you care? The question slipped out before I could stop it, sharper than I intended, not angry, just confused, because nothing about this made sense, not the way he had stepped in without raising his voice, not the way Jason had backed down without a fight, not the way I felt like something irreversible had just happened in a space that was supposed to be ordinary. For the first time, his expression changed slightly, not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough for me to catch it, a flicker of something thoughtful, something that suggested the answer was not simple. Because I was watching, he said, and the honesty in it caught me off guard, because it was not dressed up, not softened, just stated as it was, and somehow that made it more real. I swallowed, my throat suddenly dry, my mind trying to catch up with everything that had shifted in the past few minutes. That does not explain why you stepped in, I said, quieter. Now, less defensive, more uncertain. He took a step closer, not invading my space, not forcing anything, just enough to make the distance between us feel intentional rather than accidental. It explains enough, he replied, and there was something in his eyes now, something steady and deliberate, like he had already decided something I had not even considered yet. The noise of the mall faded again, not completely, but enough for the moment to feel separate, contained, like we were standing in a space that did not quite belong to anyone else. I became aware of the small details then, the faint scent of something clean and sharp, the subtle movement of his coat as he shifted slightly, the way his attention never wavered once it settled on something. Emily, he said, and hearing my name from him felt different, heavier, like it carried more weight than it should have, and I froze for a fraction of a second before responding. How do you know my name? I asked, the question coming out almost in a whisper, because that was the part that unsettled me the most, not his presence, not his authority, but the fact that he already knew something about me. He did not look surprised by the question. If anything, he seemed to expect it. Because I make it a point to know who I am watching, he said, and the calm certainty in his voice should have scared me more than it did, but instead it made something inside me settle in a way I could not explain. I exhaled slowly, my grip on the bag loosening just slightly, the tension shifting from something sharp to something quieter, more contained. That sounds intense, I said, trying to find the right word, something that would make this feel less overwhelming, less unreal. His lips curved just slightly, not quite a smile, but something close enough to soften the edges of his expression. It is necessary, he replied, and the simplicity of it made it clear that this was not something he questioned, not something he justified, just something that was. I looked at him then, really looked, taking in the details I had missed before, the way his presence seemed to shape the space around him, the way nothing about him felt accidental or uncertain, and for the first time, a thought formed clearly in my mind. Not as a question, but as a realization. Whatever world he came from, it was not one that people like me just walked into by chance, and yet somehow, without meaning to, I already had. What is your name? I asked, because it felt strange standing there, sharing a moment that felt bigger than either of us, without knowing something as simple as that. He did not hesitate. Adrian, he said, his voice low and steady, like the answer had always been there, waiting to be spoken at exactly this moment. Adrian. The name settled in my mind with an unexpected weight, like it carried more than just identity, like it was attached to something I had not yet fully seen. Emily. I replied, even though he already knew, because saying it out loud felt different now, like I was introducing myself into a version of reality that had just shifted without warning. He nodded once, acknowledging it again, not as new information, but as something confirmed. The silence between us stretched, not uncomfortable, not empty, just filled with things neither of us had said yet, and I became aware of how aware I was. Of him, of the space, of the way everything felt sharper, clearer, like my senses had adjusted to something I did not understand. You were not surprised, I said after a moment, the thought forming as I spoke it, because that was the part that lingered, the way he had stepped in like he had expected something to happen, like none of it had caught him off guard. His gaze held mine, steady, unflinching. No, he admitted simply. I felt my chest tighten slightly. Why? He tilted his head just a fraction, considering, not whether to answer, but how much to say. Because men like him do not change, he said, and there was no judgment in his tone, no anger, just certainty, like it was an observation he had made long before this moment. I let that sit for a second, because it was true in a way I had tried not to admit, not fully, not out loud. And you? I asked, the question quieter now, more careful, because I realized I did not know what category he belonged to, what kind of man stood in front of me with that level of control, that level of awareness. For the first time he did not answer immediately. The pause was brief, but it was there, and it told me more than any words could have. I am not someone you should compare, he said finally, and the way he said it was not arrogant, not dismissive, just factual, like he was stating a boundary rather than elevating himself above anything. A small shiver ran through me, not from fear, but from the realization that he was right, that whatever he was, it did not fit into anything familiar, anything I could easily understand. A voice came through the small device in his ear then, low, almost imperceptible, and his attention shifted for a fraction of a second, his gaze flicking slightly to the side before returning to me, as if nothing had interrupted him at all. We should go, he said, not abruptly, not urgently, just with a quiet finality that made it sound less like a suggestion and more like the next logical step. I hesitated, my instinct pulling me in two directions at once, one telling me to step back, to return to what I knew. Even if what I knew had just been proven unsafe, the other pulling me forward into something uncertain, something unfamiliar, but undeniably different. I told you, I can get home, I said, though the words felt weaker now, less certain, like they belonged to the version of me from an hour ago, not the one standing here now. Adrian's expression did not change, but something in his eyes sharpened slightly, not in frustration, not in impatience, but in focus. And I told you, managing is not the same as being safe, he replied, the words echoing back to me with the same calm authority, the same quiet insistence that made them impossible to ignore. I looked past him, toward the entrance, toward the world outside that suddenly felt less predictable than it had before, less secure in ways I could not fully explain. Why now? I asked, because that was the question that mattered, the one that sat beneath everything else. Why step in now, and not before? His gaze did not waver. Because now you saw me, he said, and something about that answer made my breath catch, because it shifted everything, because it meant this was no longer one-sided, no longer something happening without my awareness. I swallowed, my heart beating faster. Now, not from fear, but from the weight of the choice forming in front of me. Adrian extended his hand then, not forcefully, not demanding, just there, open, waiting, like an offer that would not be repeated. Come with me, he said, his voice softer now, but no less certain, and for a moment, the noise of the mall disappeared again, the lights dimmed in my awareness, everything narrowing down to that single gesture, that single decision. I looked at his hand, then back at his face, searching for something I could define, something I could rely on, and what I found instead was something far more unsettling and far more compelling at the same time. I found certainty, and for the first time in a long time, I realized I did not have any of my own. I did not take his hand right away, not because I wanted to refuse, but because I needed a second to understand what I was agreeing to, because something told me this was not just about leaving the mall or getting home safely. This was a step into something that did not come with easy exits or simple explanations. My fingers tightened slightly around the torn bag, the rough edge pressing into my skin like a reminder of where I had been just minutes ago, of the version of me that had been standing alone under those bright lights trying to convince herself that everything was fine. "If I go with you," I said slowly, choosing each word carefully, "what happens next?" Adrian did not lower his hand, did not rush me, did not fill the silence with promises or reassurances that sounded too easy to believe. "You get somewhere safe," he replied, his voice steady, grounded, like the answer was simple because it was meant to be. I searched his face for something more, some hidden condition, some expectation that had not been spoken yet, but there was nothing there except that same quiet certainty that had been there from the beginning. And after that, I pressed, because I needed to know where the line was, where his involvement ended, where I would be expected to stand on my own again. A faint shift crossed his expression, not hesitation, not avoidance, just consideration. "That depends on you," he said, and somehow that answer unsettled me more than any clear plan would have, because it meant this was not just his decision, it was mine too. I exhaled slowly, my heartbeat loud in my ears, the noise of the mall fading again into something distant and unimportant. I looked at his hand one more time, then at the entrance, then back at him, and something inside me made the decision before I could overthink it. I let go of the bag with one hand and placed my fingers lightly in his. His grip was firm but controlled, not pulling, not forcing, just steady, like he was making sure I would not lose my balance as everything shifted around me. The contact was brief, just enough for him to guide me forward, and then he released it, as if even that small gesture had a boundary he respected. We walked toward the entrance together, not side by side in a way that drew attention, but close enough that I could feel the presence of him beside me, the subtle awareness of every movement around us. People moved out of the way without being asked, without even realizing they were doing it, creating a path that felt both unnatural and completely expected at the same time. The glass doors opened automatically, a rush of cooler air meeting us as we stepped outside, and I realized how much I had been holding in, how tight my chest had been until that moment. The parking area stretched out in front of us, cars lined in neat rows under the fading afternoon light, but my attention went immediately to the black car I had seen before, now closer, more real, its presence undeniable. The driver stood beside it, already opening the rear door as we approached, his posture straight, his movements precise, like everything had been timed before we even started walking. I slowed for a second, my steps faltering just slightly as reality caught up with me, as the weight of what I was doing settled in fully. Adrian noticed immediately. He always noticed. "Emily," he said, my name quieter now, not a command, not a push, just a reminder that I was still part of this decision, that I had not lost control of it even if it felt like I had. I looked at him, searching again, not for certainty this time, but for something human, something I could hold on to beyond the control, beyond the precision, and I found it in the smallest shift of his expression, something softer, something that did not belong to the man who had just silenced a situation with nothing but a look. "You can still walk away," he added, and the words surprised me, because I had not expected that option to still exist, not after everything, not after I had already stepped forward. I glanced back toward the mall, the bright lights visible through the glass, the place where I had been standing just minutes ago feeling small and exposed and alone, and then I looked at the car in front of me, at the open door, at the unknown waiting on the other side. "No," I said finally, my voice steadier than I felt. "I think I already did enough walking away." Adrian held my gaze for a moment longer, then nodded once, a quiet acknowledgement that felt more significant than anything else that had been said. I took a step forward, then another, and as I lowered myself into the seat, the door closing softly behind me. I realized something that sent a different kind of awareness through me, something that settled deep and did not leave. This was not just about being safe anymore. This was about crossing a line I could not uncross, into a world that had already been watching me long before I ever noticed it was there. The door closed with a soft, controlled sound that felt louder than it should have, like it marked something final even though nothing had been said out loud. And for a moment, I just sat there, my hands resting in my lap, my fingers still slightly tense as if they had not caught up with the decision I had just made. The interior of the car was quieter than any space I had been in that day. The noise of the outside world cut off completely, replaced by a low, steady hum that made everything feel contained, deliberate. I became aware of small details first, the smooth leather beneath my fingertips, the faint scent of something clean and expensive, the subtle reflection of my own face in the tinted window, and for a second, I barely recognized myself, like I was looking at someone who had stepped into a different version of her life, without warning. Adrian entered a moment later, the door on the other side opening and closing with the same quiet precision, and when he settled into the seat beside me, the space shifted again, not smaller, not crowded, just more defined, like his presence gave the moment a structure it had not had before. "Drive," he said, and the word was simple, calm, but it carried the kind of authority that did not need to be repeated. The car moved almost immediately, smooth and steady, pulling away from the curb with a quiet confidence that matched everything else about him. I watched the mall fade behind us through the window, the bright lights growing smaller, less significant, until they disappeared completely, and with them, the version of the day that had started there. Silence settled between us again, but it was different now, heavier, filled with everything I had not asked yet, everything I did not understand. I shifted slightly, turning just enough to look at him, studying the profile I had only seen in fragments before, the sharp lines, the controlled stillness, the way nothing about him seemed uncertain or out of place. "Where are we going?" I asked, my voice steady, but quieter than usual, like the space itself demanded a different kind of tone. He did not look at me right away. His gaze remained forward, focused, as if the answer was already decided before I had asked the question. "Somewhere you can breathe," he said after a moment, and the simplicity of it made my chest tighten in a way I did not expect, because it sounded less like a location and more like a promise. I let that sit for a second, my mind trying to attach it to something concrete, something I could understand, but it stayed abstract, just out of reach. "You do this often?" I asked, the question slipping out before I could filter it, because the ease of everything, the way he had stepped in, the way everything had shifted around him, did not feel like something new. This time, he turned his head slightly, just enough for his eyes to meet mine, and the look he gave me was calm, but direct, like he was measuring not just the question, but the reason behind it. "No," he said, and there was no hesitation in it, no room for interpretation, just a clear answer that felt more significant because of how certain it was. I held his gaze for a moment longer, searching for something that might contradict it, some sign that this was just another version of a pattern I had not yet seen, but there was nothing there except that same steady focus. "Then why me?" I asked, softer now, because that was the question that mattered, the one that had been building since the moment he stepped into my line of sight. He did not answer immediately. The silence stretched just enough to make me think he might not answer at all, and then he spoke, his voice lower now, more deliberate. "Because you did not ask for help," he said, and the words caught me off guard, because they were not what I expected, not something obvious or easy to dismiss. I frowned slightly, trying to understand. "That is exactly why I should not need it," I replied, the old instinct surfacing again, the one that told me needing anything was a weakness I could not afford. Something shifted in his expression then, subtle but real, like he had been waiting for that response. "No," he said quietly, "that is exactly why you do." The words landed differently than anything else he had said, not heavy, not forceful, but precise, like they found a place inside me I had spent a long time ignoring. I looked away, my gaze moving to the window, watching the city pass by in blurred lines of light and shadow, familiar streets turning into something else entirely under the tinted glass. My reflection stared back at me again, but this time, I saw the difference, not in my appearance, but in the way I held myself, the way something had shifted without asking permission. "You do not know me," I said after a moment, not as a challenge, but as a fact I needed to hold on to. "I know enough," Adrian replied, and when I looked back at him, there was something in his eyes that made it clear he meant it, not in a way that felt invasive, but in a way that felt intentional, like he had chosen to see me when no one else had bothered to look closely enough. The car turned then, the movement smooth, controlled, and I felt it in the way my body leaned slightly with the motion, in the way the outside world shifted direction without warning, and I realized something in that moment. Something quiet, but undeniable. I had not just left the mall behind. I had stepped into something that was already moving forward, with or without me, and somehow, without fully understanding how, I had become part of it. The city outside the window kept moving, but inside the car, time felt different, slower, stretched in a way that made every thought louder than it should have been, and I could not tell if that was because of where I was or who I was sitting next to. I watched the streets blur past, familiar storefronts and intersections slipping by like something I used to belong to but no longer fully recognized, and the farther we drove, the more that distance settled into something real. "You said you know enough," I said after a while, breaking the quiet that had settled again, because the words had stayed with me, echoing in a way I could not ignore. "What does that mean?" Adrian did not respond immediately. His gaze remained forward, his posture unchanged, like he had all the time in the world to decide how much of that answer I was ready to hear. "It means I know what you tolerate," he said finally, and the way he said it made my chest tighten again, because it was not about facts or details, it was about something deeper, something I had not put into words myself. I frowned slightly, turning toward him, trying to understand. "That is not the same as knowing me," I replied, quieter now, more careful, because I was not sure where this conversation was leading, only that it was moving somewhere important. He turned his head just enough for his eyes to meet mine again, steady and unwavering. "It is a start," he said, and there was something in the way he said it that made it clear he was not interested in surface-level understanding, not interested in the version of me that people saw when they did not look closely. I looked away again, my reflection faint in the window, the city lights catching in the glass, and I realized how exposed that made me feel, not in a physical way, but in a way that reached deeper, like he could see the parts of me I had spent years keeping quiet. "And what exactly do you think I tolerate?" I asked, my voice softer now, not defensive, but uncertain, because I was not sure I wanted to hear the answer. He did not hesitate this time. "Being treated like you do not matter," he said, and the words landed with a precision that made it impossible to dismiss them, because they were not dramatic, not exaggerated, just accurate in a way I had avoided acknowledging. I swallowed, my throat tight, my fingers curling slightly in my lap as if I needed something to hold on to. "That is not fair," I said, though the protest felt weaker than I intended, like it did not fully believe itself. Adrian did not react to the words, did not argue, did not push. He simply watched me, letting the silence stretch long enough for the truth to settle on its own. "Fair is not the point," he said after a moment, his voice still calm, still controlled. "Accurate is." I exhaled slowly, my gaze dropping for a second, the weight of that statement pressing in a way that was uncomfortable but impossible to ignore. The car slowed then, the movement subtle but noticeable, and I glanced up, realizing we were turning off the main road, the city noise fading into something quieter, more contained. The buildings here were different, less crowded, more spaced out, the kind of area that did not feel like it belonged to the same pace as everything else. "Where are we?" I asked, my attention shifting outward, trying to ground myself in something physical, something I could understand. "Almost there," Adrian replied, and there was something in his tone that made me believe him without question, not because I had proof, but because everything about him suggested he did not say things he did not mean. The car turned again, slower this time, and then came to a smooth stop in front of a building that looked nothing like the places I was used to, clean lines, quiet presence, the kind of place that did not need to announce its value because it was already understood. The driver stepped out immediately, moving to open the door with the same precise efficiency as before, and for a second, I did not move, my hand resting lightly against the seat, my mind catching up with the reality of where I was. Adrian shifted slightly. Beside me, not rushing, not pushing, just present, and I felt that awareness again, that quiet pressure that was not force, but expectation. "You can take a moment," he said, his voice lower now, almost softer, and the permission in it caught me off guard, because I had expected urgency, expected direction, but instead, he gave me space, and somehow that made everything feel more real. I took a breath, then another, steadying myself, and when I finally moved, stepping out of the car into the quieter air, I realized something had already changed in a way I could not reverse. This was no longer about what had happened at the mall. This was about what came after, and for the first time, I understood that whatever came next was not something I would be able to pretend did not matter. I stood there for a moment longer than necessary, the quiet of the place settling around me like something unfamiliar but not unwelcome, the kind of quiet that did not come from emptiness but from control, from everything being exactly where it was supposed to be. The building in front of me did not feel like somewhere people simply lived. It felt intentional, like every detail had been chosen, every line designed to keep chaos out. I became aware of how out of place I must have looked, standing there with a torn shopping bag and shoes that had seen better days, the contrast sharp enough to make me hesitate just slightly before taking another step. Adrian moved ahead of me, not far, just enough to guide the direction without making it feel like I was being led, and the entrance opened before we even reached it, a quiet acknowledgement of his presence that did not require explanation. Inside, the air shifted again, cooler, cleaner, the kind of environment where nothing was accidental, and I felt it in the way my shoulders adjusted, the way my breathing slowed without me meaning it to. "This is where you bring people you barely know?" I asked, my voice softer now, not because I was afraid, but because something about the space made loudness feel unnecessary. Adrian did not slow his pace, but he did glance back at me briefly, his expression unreadable but not distant. "No," he said simply, and that single word carried more weight than a longer explanation ever could. I followed him down a short hallway, the sound of our footsteps muted against the polished floor, and I realized how aware I was of every movement, every shift in the air, like my senses had not yet decided whether to relax or stay alert. He stopped in front of a door that blended seamlessly into the wall, something I might have missed entirely if I had been alone, and with a small motion, it opened, revealing a space that felt both larger and quieter than anything we had passed so far. "You can stay here for now," he said, stepping slightly aside, giving me a clear path forward without stepping into it himself. I hesitated at the threshold, my hand tightening around the bag again, the torn edge catching slightly against my fingers, grounding me in something familiar. "For now," I repeated, because the words mattered, because they implied something temporary in a situation that felt anything but. He watched me carefully, not pushing, not filling the silence, just letting me process it in my own time. "Until you decide what comes next," he said, and there it was again, that same pattern, that same quiet insistence that this was not something he was forcing on me, but something I was choosing, even if it did not feel like it yet. I stepped inside slowly, taking in the space, the clean lines, the absence of clutter, the sense that everything had a place and nothing was left to chance. It felt safe in a way I was not used to, not because it was warm or welcoming, but because it was controlled, because nothing here seemed capable of slipping out of place without someone noticing. I set the bag down on a nearby surface, the paper crinkling softly, and for a second, that small sound felt louder than anything else. "You do not have to stay." Adrian's voice came from behind me, calm, steady, reminding me again that the door was not closed unless I chose it to be. I turned to face him, studying him in a way I had not allowed myself to before, not just the details, not just the presence, but the intention behind it all, the reason he had stepped in, the reason I was standing here now instead of somewhere else. "You keep saying that," I said quietly, "but you also make it very clear that walking away would not be the same as before." Something shifted in his gaze then, not defensive, not guarded, just honest in a way that felt rare. "Because it would not be," he said, and there was no hesitation in it, no attempt to soften the truth. I let that sit for a moment, the weight of it settling into place, and for the first time since I had stepped into this world, I stopped trying to find a way back to what I knew. "Then maybe I do not want it to be the same," I said, the words surprising even me as they left my mouth, because they felt like a decision, not a reaction. Adrian held my gaze, steady and unyielding, and for a second, the room felt smaller, more focused, like everything had narrowed down to this one moment. Good, he said finally, his voice lower now, more deliberate, and there was something in it that felt like approval, but not the kind I had spent years trying to earn, something different, something that acknowledged choice rather than rewarded it. I exhaled slowly, the tension in my shoulders easing just slightly, and as I looked around the room again, at the quiet, the control, the space that had been offered without condition, I realized something that settled deeper than anything else that had happened that day. He did not raise his voice. He did not force my hand. He simply changed the standard of what I was willing to accept, and once I saw it, I could not pretend I had not.